name's Drew Hanna. I handle biz dev primarily for payers in the US for Smile CDR. Adam is basically our sales engineer, and we do a lot of work together. And Adam, if you could, I'm not going to tax Adam's abilities too much today beyond presenting the slides. I thought for today, I'd go a little bit, let's say one step up from payer to payer. We are going to drive into some payer to payer detail, but I thought I'd talk about the fact that payer to payer is really fundamentally the first of the interoperability mandates where you've got to start accepting data and accepting data potentially from non-trading partners. Everything up to now for July was just, taking data you already had and sending it out. Promise not to give you too much about, Smile. We'll get to the subject, but I will just to anybody who's not familiar with Smile, you can think of us as fundamentally having two products overall under our umbrella. One is we are the maintainer of the open source Happy Fire. And then we take that foundation of Happy Fire and build on top of it a commercial enterprise Fire-based solution, which is Smile CDR. As a number you may know, Happy Fire is probably the most used Fire platform in the world. And a variety of our competition, et cetera, use the same foundation that we maintain. Adam, next slide. So what I thought I'd talk about today is what payer to payer is the start of, but if you kind of don't have on your radar what is coming and what payer to payer starts, you're in for a bit of a rude surprise. And by that, I mean that, again, payer to payer is a scenario where all of a sudden you are being asked to exchange data. And there's a fair amount of, let's say, admin and coordination to that data exchange that needs to happen. But with that, I think every payer has gotten surprised by the No Surprises Act and what it does to the price transparency rule. Do know that when it comes to price transparency, as it is in the No Surprises Act, that is not affecting qualified plans, but that is going to affect commercial plans. And we'll talk a bit more about that. At the moment, the government has done a fine job of putting that effectively as the same date, Jan 1 of next year, as payer to payer. So there's some interesting work, and similar to at least the stats that I've heard relative to July is only about 50% of the payers have got to where they need to just to meet July. I'm certainly concerned about what that means for January 1st. I'll do a mini sales plug just to say that Smile has a great track record of bringing our client base to meeting July 1 so far. Prior auth, which comes in 2023, is also a massive data exchange effort. And I'll mute my phone. And then ultimately, we're also going to be having data coming in from a number of providers when effectively HEDIS, or the future of HEDIS's Fire, when that aspect of things come about. Most people expect that will start more in earnest in fall of next year. Next slide, Adam. So I mentioned those implementation dates, and I put in my bad ability with graphics just the star around that January 1 to say, boy, oh boy, not only do you have payer to payer, but on the commercial side, at the moment, it looks like you've got some pretty heavy lifting to do for price transparency under No Surprises. And by the way, I say under No Surprises, just to be clear that part of the confusion and part of why a lot of payers don't see the red flag going up is they say, oh yeah, I've got price transparency covered based on what they knew from the mandate of last year. And effectively I'm saying, and I'll show you a slide or two, boy, you need to take a hard look at what's change due to the No Surprises Act. Next slide, Adam. So ultimately, all these use cases are for these mandates require very specific workflows and rules, and they'll require actionable alerts and triggers, a use of MDM or some kind of EMPI to provide, and an overall QA to say, before I'm allowing whatever data is coming in to come in, I've got to really perform some Q&A potentially on it, be it automated or with some manual oversight added, to make sure that I'm not taking in garbage data, and that not only is that data valid, but I need to make sure I match it to the right member. As you may remember way back, when we were talking about the July mandates, so to speak, initially, one of the things that was always thrown out was that if you use OAuth, you effectively, if you have a breach through OAuth, well, that will not be considered a HIPAA violation. But what is a HIPAA violation is if you match the wrong data, so match somebody else's clinical data to a member and then show it, that is a HIPAA violation. So that's key. One of the keys is making sure you get that matching right. And ultimately, it's going to be about storing the data in the right place and then sending the data at the right time to the right place. Next slide, Adam. So ultimately, these mandates are creating a path that ultimately you could go back to, say, the Cures Act. Yeah, the overall mandate is to move us from volume to value, and part of that is through, hey, can we really make sure that we're exchanging data in healthcare the way some other industries do, and ultimately to create that better longitudinal record, the ability to see that patient's data, et cetera. But all of this fundamentally is a move to say payers are going to have to start to automate and administer large volumes of data from sources that they haven't had to before, and create a bunch of workflow to deal with that, or again, create what I'll call, for lack of a better term, data exchange hubs to handle these different mandates. And this will lead to a fundamental transformation either of their IT services or the IT services provided to them by their service provider to handle these data exchanges. And those payers who struggle with this transformation of meeting these massive mandated changes, it will really be a key to their success and survival. Next slide. So this is a way to talk a little bit about at least how we approach at Smile our platform, but ultimately this applies to whatever vendor and what you should be looking for to meet these mandates. And one of the key pieces here is that, as opposed to, let's say, what we had to do for Patient Access API, you now really need a much more strategic and flexible platform than what you may have needed for July. And in particular, highly recommend you look to a scenario where you can create things like purpose-built repositories. In meeting with our clients and prospects about P2P, it is clear that each payer often has their own vision and their own needs of how they want to handle things. So for example, you may have a purpose-built repository that will be, in this case, just there for receiving data. And then you may have another purpose-built repository that works as your Q&A. And ultimately, maybe you then take that data after it passes through the Q&A and place it into maybe the same repository you use for patient access. But I know I've encountered a couple of payers already who have stated to me, gee, Drew, we'd like to we don't really want to mix that data. We'd like to keep it separate. Can we do that in a separate instance of the platform? And ultimately use, and in the case of Smile, we do support something called a fire gateway, allowing you to put one query against multiple instances, so to speak. And just highly recommending that you really have a scenario that your folks with your architecture can be comfortable that your solution can meet that kind of scenario of creating purpose-built repositories and let alone purpose-built separate instances, et cetera. For the rules, and we'll touch on this a little bit more later. Notice I used the word plural for rules. I will tell you that Smile is adopting a hybrid solution. And what I mean by that, and if we have time, I'll dive into it a bit later, that for payer to payer, there are really two versions of the rule. And there's the rule that came out with the final rules, 2020, and then there's the proposed rule for 2023. I know in a previous WEDI forum, I asked the question of Alexandra Muggy that, hey, if you work to the 2023 proposed rule, which is the fire only rule, would you be considered compliant? And fundamentally, with a little hedge, she said yes. I will tell you that what we are doing at Smile is effectively supporting a hybrid solution, one that effectively, oh, I'm hearing some background noise. One that basically allows you to adopt to both versions of the rule. And just to comment a little bit on that, one of the things that we support in here is the bulk export. And the bulk export also, by its very nature, the fire bulk export does allow, just like fire, external reference pointers, external document pointers in every resource/profile. If you have those, so for example, let's say you have a clinical resource that's pointing to an image, a non-fire image, we are setting up to be able to support not only sending that out, the non-fire piece with the fire bulk export, and on the import, maintain that pointer and thus maintain that match to the non-fire data. Anyway, I think I will leave that there, but just to say again, we are working to support both versions of the rule, so to speak, with a hybrid solution. So here's an example of effectively kind of a, I'll call it a architecture slide, one where we can present the architecture, but in a manner that's a little more digestible than the type that Adam liked. Anyway, so on the left-hand side, what we envision is ultimately using one or two similar Smart on Fire apps to allow for either the member enrollment to be added to a member enrollment form as a pop-up, or to be added for the X plan. There are some subtle differences, to say the least, actually, between the two, but we allow for that flexibility. Because again, the rules, final rule is X member initiated, proposed rule is member on enrollment. Also, we realize that no matter what, when it comes to especially enrollment, a lot of that does not happen necessarily by a member logging on or online. A lot of that happens on phone or potentially in person across a desk. And ultimately, what we see for the administration console is a tool that the admin folks internally can use, both from, we could say, from a tech IT perspective, but also from your admin who may be in the role of, hey, I just handle enrollment. I'm at the help desk and someone has asked, to add this kind of transfer to their enrollment. We see that type of functionality where it's going to have to roll out all the way to potentially, your call centers, et cetera, is being key to making this work. And in particular with the second version of the rule. I'm also going to comment here that because the two versions of the rule are fundamentally different in certain respects, for example, one being, hey, I'm just sending US CDI or non-fire data. The other being, I'm sending fire data and fire data only. We see them fundamentally, if you just work to the final rule, so to speak, you're going to have a fair amount of work to do next year to adjust to the proposed rule, which again, clearly seems to be the path that this is going, or to kind of give the universal reaction to the final rule for the most part was one of not sure how this sending non-fire data and how come a payer-to-payer exchange doesn't include claims in EOB. So it's just US CDI, left a lot of people scratching their head, not seeing how it promoted interoperability, et cetera. So it certainly feels like the proposed rule is what's coming. I'll also note for you that some of the other pieces on here, when it comes to finding another payer, we're supporting both use of fire endpoint directories like CAQH, but also allowing for those folks who do not want to get involved with CAQH for whatever reason to have considerably, you could say, more work, but to create their own payer registry of those endpoints. And then similar to what Max said, like everyone, you can't do this stuff without Providence supporting that. We support a staging environment for MDM, but sure enough, we know that, again, every payer's got, a lot of them have their own MDM that we need to interface with, et cetera. And we support, if nothing else, I'll say a fair amount of flexibility in doing that. And also, again, we offer very granular consent. And with that, some of the things that were mentioned earlier, sensitivity tagging and doing those kinds of filters, et cetera, are built in. Adam, next slide, unless you want to add anything I've missed. Actually, this is Adam's slide to talk about prior auth.
Thank you, Drew. And by the way, I'm so glad you showed up for this presentation that I didn't have to wing your part there. All right, so just next few slides, Drew and I are going to talk about some of the components that are, or regulations that are running concurrently or in rapid sequence to the payer-to-payer data exchange. And one of them, of course, is the prior authorization, or as it's probably better known as burden reduction. We see that there's a fair bit of overlap from an administration level for the payers for the payer-to-payer, the burden reduction, the price transparency in HEDIS. And from that view, we look at creating solutions that are point solutions, but also part of a holistic whole that allows for easier administration management. So in that context, just to talk quickly, some background on the burden reduction. I think many of you know, but I'm going to assume some of you don't know. The impact is really significant, and the impact on care, quality of care, timeliness of care, and your member and patient outcomes. And I'm not going to read from this slide, but it's been up for a moment, and I assume you've had a chance just to take a note of, if you're not already familiar with it, the impact numbers. Flipping through the next couple slides pretty quickly. Prior authorization rule comes into effect exactly a year after the payer-to-payer. the usual slide here that goes through all the rationalizations, why it's important to you as payers, and the benefits that will and you'll incur out of this. I'm not going to read these bullet points, but to focus a little bit here, what are the key benefits to you in a tangible sense, and as a payer? Well, here we go. The it's the impact is suggested that it's going to be greater than a 60% reduction in the administrative implications. You're going to have a great deal of insights and control over the prior authorization process, be able to do real-time determinations, and faster and more efficient turnarounds. And I'll turn it back to you, Drew, to talk about the no surprises in HEDIS.
Yeah. So this is, the next two slides are really just to scare you. No, they're scenarios that represent some of the workflows that are involved because of the No Surprises Act with price transparency. And this is just a quick example of just the advanced EOB process. And in here, it's like, hey, patient schedules with the provider. Then the provider's got the, has to send a good faith estimate of charges to the plan. And they've got to do that within 2 days. Now, in the 1 to 3 day scenario, all depending on when the procedure is to take place or the service, by the way, if it's within 10 days, you've got like a day to turn this around. But the bottom line is then you need to be sending out an advanced EOB. And by the way, I'm going to remind everyone that this is, though, on the commercial side. And it's all about finding out pricing, let's say, in network and out of network to compare. So it doesn't, this is not a qualified plan mandate. This is the commercial side. But anyway, you've got 3 days to send out that advanced EOB. And it's not just, send out something automated to an app. Indeed, you've got a flag to say, oh no, that's got to be on paper in the mail by such and such a date. This is one of the workflows. And if we go to the next slide, in this one, I really don't intend anybody to take in this slide too deep, but I consider this sort of the freak out slide that ultimately, when you look at what's needed to meet this No Surprises Act on price transparency, the workflow is intense and demanding. It requires things like a cost comparison tool that you see over on the left. And really the goal of this slide via DaVinci is to really just make you aware of the level of work that is on the table. And at the moment for January, and we'll see how that adjusts. And next slide, please, Adam. Then, ultimately, again, I said this speech was all about data exchange. And then coming down the pike will be what's going to happen with HEDIS. And the idea of really moving out of that small sample size and chart chasing that HEDIS currently is into a scenario where potentially payers are getting from their provider network US CDI and other clinical data in FHIR in near time. At the same time, potentially taking unstructured data and using NLP, and ultimately passing all of that through the measures, which will be in clinical quality language, CQL, to ultimately effectively create your scores, so to speak, for those measures in real time or near time. Combined with that, though, overall will be a scenario where at least we are working with the partner Strata, who one of the things that they provide is not just meeting the HEDIS measures, but providing a dashboard into gaps in care in near time, and ultimately this leading to potentially actionable alerts that allow you to go back to the provider and ultimately to the member/patient and improve that quality of care. On that note, Adam, while I put up our while I put up the slide of our architecture, why don't I just stop for the all of 3 minutes I left for questions? Sorry about that.
Yeah, Drew, we do have a couple of questions, and I'll read the first one, and I will point out that we see the questions on Zoom. So I saw a comment about posting questions on Wahoo. If you are posting them there, it's I'll leave it to you, Michael, to read them. But I'll start with the ones on Zoom. And Drew, I'm hoping you can help out with these. So first from Denny, are payers and providers striking more value-based contracts to reduce the burden that fee-for-service creates for both them and in meeting data sharing, cost transparency, prior auth, and no surprises regulations?
Yeah. Recently, I asked a couple of different payers, hey, are you planning to indeed change your provider network contracts to account for this? And pretty much the answer I've heard so far has been one of, we're starting to talk about how that will happen, but I can't say I've heard of an instance yet of that happening, but I can't see how ultimately you're going to be able to deliver on these mandates without an element of that, if not a significant element of that. Next question.
Great. Next one. Sorry, I'm not going to pronounce your name. I'm afraid I won't do it justice. The question is, on July 1st, 2021, CMS published the quote unquote final No Surprises Act for 60-day public comment. Is the advanced EOB requirement still included in that?
Yeah. Unless something changed the next day. I know they plan an update. The next scheduled update relative to that, I believe, is October. So we will see what comes down the pike. But at the moment, yeah, the advanced EOB is in there.
Right. And thank you. And Beth pointed out that the next session is the regulatory update, which I know we are all quite anxious to hear about. So many of the challenges in implementing these solutions is interpreting the finer details. Okay.
Adam, Drew, thank you so much for this informative and well put together presentation.